AI is like a mirror that reflects our biases back towards us. We humans, we make the data, we make the machines that make the data, which is what is being used to train all of these AI models. But we're fallible as humans. Like, we have over 188 biases and counting. We have to be brave enough to look into the mirror and decide, is what is being reflected back, does that align with our values? If it does align, be transparent. But if it doesn't align, if you find that there's a mismatch, that's when you know you need a pivot and you need to change.
TDW fans, we are excited to have Phaedra Boinodiris on the show today. Phaedra is IBM Consulting's global leader for Trustworthy AI. You may know her from her prolific public speaking and from the powerful book that she just launched, AI for the Rest of Us. I'm holding it up here. It is fantastic. And she's also the co-founder of the Future World Alliance, a nonprofit dedicated to curating K-12 education and AI ethics, which I am sure a lot of parents are going to be curious about, and we'll be getting into that. She's an outspoken voice on why and how we must develop AI more thoughtfully and responsibly as leaders, as companies, as a society, and of course, as parents. Phaedra, welcome to TDW.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Phaedra, my co-host and co-pilot Nate Thompson is leading a senior executive offsite in Dallas today, so it'll just be us today. So let's talk about AI. For tech that will have an impact likened to the internet or the atom bomb, what's the most important thing to ensure we don't screw this up?
Well, really to make sure that we are developing AI in a way that reflects our human values, I think is key. And that it reflects the needs of all the diverse communities that we need to serve.
In your book, you talked about how misrepresented the actual number of developers are compared to what we would need, that this is just basic math. That you have roughly 8 billion people on the globe, and for AI to be considered ethical or fairly representing us, that big tech would need about 1.6 billion people who understand it developing it, right? But even if every person at a big tech company, as of some of the most recent readings of how many people work there in these companies that are actually developing AI solutions, there's only about 2.4 million people in total. And only a fraction of them understand how to develop AI, are good data scientists, understand, what are the best practices. So talk to us. How do we get around this? How do we start to create something that is more fairly representative?
We mentioned at the onset, what we're trying to do is have our human values be reflected in our AI models. And that's not strictly a technical challenge with a technical solution, but one that is socio-technical. And anytime you hear the word socio-technical, you've got to approach it holistically, meaning, people, process, tools, people, what is the right culture, organizational culture that is required to curate AI responsibly? What are the right AI governance processes and the right tools and AI engineering frameworks? And of those three, I'm certain you and your audience can guess which is the toughest. Guess. If you guess people, you guessed correctly. The culture is really hard. And when thinking about what is the right culture required to curate AI responsibly, per what you're saying, you've got to be thinking about who today has the power to decide which data to use to curate our AI models. Are these people really diverse and inclusive? The answer is no. There's a very tiny homogeneous group of people who have that position. And it is not mainly women or Black, Indigenous people of color. It is not.
No.
So in order, as you said, to have our AI models better reflect the needs of the diverse communities that we ultimately have to serve, we need to have far more different kinds of people developing these AI models. And I would opine the systems of governance around those AI models too. And I don't just mean gender and race and ethnicity, but earnestly, people with just different lived world experiences is really, really key. In addition to thinking about who and what their backgrounds are, it's also important to be thinking that these practitioners also need to be multidisciplinary in nature, which I really pushed on in the book, which leads me to answering your question, which is the way that we do this is really focusing on hosting a much smarter conversation on the subject of AI and AI literacy, because today, I think that the way we've been teaching the subject of AI in schools, in academic institutions, even in informal learning settings, in corporations, I think has been far, far too myopic, and that needs to change.
Yeah. And I think part of that, from a myopic perspective, something that I see, right, is most everyone I talk to, whether it's on the show, whether it's companies that we consult with, whether it's in my friend circles, events that I go to, it's all about generative AI, which is great, right? Generative AI has entered the public consciousness. We're all trying to figure out how to use it. Companies are trying to figure out how to use it. But when people think about responsible AI development, they're reading about, hey, Google Gemini really screwed up that launch. And they depicted a bunch of historical leaders that were misgendered or the wrong ethnicity. Now that's serious, right? Because you have a major tech corporation rewriting history in an irresponsible way. So that's a big deal, and that impacts society. But I think that something that comes up for me is that people don't personalize it beyond that. They're like, well, that's bad, and the hallucinations are bad, and maybe I need to double check the output from ChatGPT. But your book goes into some very specific use cases about what's happening at a global and broader level, a broader societal level with the consequences from poorly trained algorithms. So you have things where people are maybe not getting into the school that they want to get into because their skills aren't being correctly evaluated. They aren't getting the job that they want to get because AI is now looking at their resume and it might be missing things. They are not understanding that maybe they got rejected for a loan that they desperately needed for their home or for something else because of some sort of inherent bias in AI. And it gets more serious. You mentioned a use case. I think the company's name was Viogen. This was a AI trained algorithm that was assessing the risk of domestic abuse for women who were cohabiting with, I guess, convicted felons or with people who had records of domestic abuse, and determining whether they were at high risk or at low risk. And it miscorrectly profiled them as low risk. And these women were murdered.
19 women were murdered who had gone through the system, whose information had been put into the algorithm, or their partner's information had been put into the algorithm. But there's the silver lining to that story, if there is one at all, because it is a dark story, is that audit went public. The police force that had procured that AI model, they changed course based on the results of that audit. So, for example, they had a very public conversation about, is that an appropriate use for artificial intelligence? And then, if it is, were any victims of domestic abuse part of the conversation, right? And then they found out as part of the audit that the algorithm was skewed to assume that if a complaint or a concern was coming from a wealthy household, that somehow you could devalue the risk. So again, it speaks to the fact that my favorite definition of the word data, which is what is being used to train all of these AI models, is that it's an artifact of the human experience, right? We humans, we make the data, we make the machines that make the data, but we're fallible as humans. Like, we have over 188 biases and counting. And, we've got these biases since the dawn of humankind. But one thing that I really want your listeners to remember when thinking about AI is that ultimately AI is like a mirror that reflects our biases back towards us. But we have to be brave enough and introspective enough, like the police department was with that public audit, right? To look into the mirror and decide, is what is being reflected back, does that align with our values. If it does align, be transparent. Here's why we picked the data that we did. Here's why we picked the approach or the methodology that we did. But if it doesn't align, if you find that there's a mismatch, that's when you know you need to pivot and you need to change.
Well, and you said in the book we have 188 unconscious biases and counting. That's not looking in the mirror, that's staring at it, right?
Yeah. But you got to be brave and you got to be looking at it and saying, do I like this reflection? Does it align with what I believe to be true and what I believe are the values that we need to make sure are reflected in this model? It's such a fascinating exercise. And, we talk about like which human values, whose ethics, right? Which is something else that I've been hearing a lot about. And it's that too is important, and why I'm saying the things that I'm saying about we've got it. We have to have it be far more multidisciplinary in nature because these questions are not strictly technical. Yeah, for example, I'm working with a client right now out of the state of California that are thinking about what human values they want to see reflected in AI models that are going to be used by children, right? Kindergarten through 12th grade kids. And in addition to things like fairness and explainability and transparency and data privacy, they're also saying things like kindness. We think our AI models need to be kind, but then you need to be thinking through like, what are the functional and non-functional requirements that we demand to see in an AI model that's going to be kind? What does that look like? Again, these are not strictly technical questions.
And these are subjective terms. Kindness means very different things to different people. The word love means different things to different people. The word fairness means different things to different people. And so that's where that sample size really needs to get much, much bigger.
And the multidisciplinary approach to teaching the subject. You see what I'm saying? Like, why are we just teaching AI in computer science classes? Or why are we teaching it just in the schools of engineering? Why are we not really pushing for a interdisciplinary approach where you've got, professors from the School of Government talking about regulations. You've got the philosophy school. You've got linguistics. Because this is what it's going to take in order to be really figuring out how do we answer these questions on what is the kind of relationship that we want to have with AI.
So how are you guys doing this at IBM? What is the ethical governance model to train AI, remove bias, and use better data at IBM? How are you doing it? How are you leading it? Because it is so hard, as you're saying. I mean, there's so much nuance here.
And the hardest part, like I said, is culture. The hardest part is always people and sort of what are you communicating about this space? Because as much as there is to learn, there's also a lot that has to be unlearned. So you got to approach this with humility. Some of the things that we did, right, was we started developing tools to get a sense as to how AI models are behaving way well back in 2013 to do things like measure bias, for example, or accuracy of the output. 2015, we hired our very first AI ethics leader. A couple of years later, we stood up our very first AI ethics board, and this was one of the first in the industry. This was way back in the day, right? And we ended up publishing principles for AI, which when you look at them, you're like, this is obvious. Like these principles are obvious, but actually there's a lot that had to happen to make these actionable. For example, like the first principle that we came up with was the purpose of AI, right? The purpose of AI is not meant to displace human beings. It is not meant to have control over people. We're saying it is meant to augment human intelligence. But what that means is we actually had to train people to be thinking about what should the experience be like of a human being if they've been augmented by AI. We're assuming they need to be empowered. How do you measure empowerment? So one of the things we did was we stood up an AI design guild, right? Training people with backgrounds in design, sociology, psychology, anthropology, right? Industrial organizational psychology, behavioral science, to be thinking through this kind of question. How do we empower? How do we give power to? The second principle is a statement about consent, right? Who does the data and insights associated with those data belong to? And then the third one mandates that AI systems should be transparent and explainable, right? Which again gets back to like, what are the human centric questions that we need to ask in order to be able to earn trust in the AI models that are being built? And I mentioned already, some of the ones that we had come up with, right? I mentioned transparency, explainability, but also fairness. But again, you mentioned like whose definition of the word fairness? Is it equality? Is it equity? Is it meritocracy? Is it something else? Right? Data privacy, robustness against adversaries. And each of these takes a lot to train people to know how to do and how to think through. Several years ago, I worked to stand up what we call a Trustworthy AI Center of Excellence. And we knew this going in about culture, right? And everything that I'm saying about diversity and multidisciplinary. And when we stood up this Center of Excellence or COE, we said overtly, I don't care what your background is. I don't care that you're not a PhD in machine learning or you're not a data scientist. I mean, if you're interested in the subject of how to have AI better reflect the needs of diverse communities, you're invited here. You have a seat at this table. And then what we did was we said, you're going to work on projects together in these diverse global multidisciplinary teams to really think through like, how do we do this work? How do we make an interpretable fact sheet? How do we measure empowerment? What does equity look like in an AI model? How do we measure equity? And, we've created reports based on this work, and we've been publicly publishing them, just donating them,
That's fantastic.
so that people can replicate this work.
It's absolutely fantastic. I want to double click on something that takes us right into chapter 6 on your book, which, by the way, in the LinkedIn comments about your book, a lot of people were going bananas about chapter 6. So chapter 6 is called Positive Parenting. And I'm going to read this directly. I'm going to go old school. I'm not going to pull this from a Google Doc, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to read from the book. AI should tell you why it knows what it knows and where did it learn from to say what it said. After it says something, you should be able to ask, how do you know that? Where did you learn that? The organization that is accountable for AI should be able to detail this to you in language that is understandable to you and make this information very easily found. Once this is done, then you can use this amazingly awesome tool because it is a source of knowledge that you may trust. Now, this is fantastic. The tension point that I see with what you wrote here is that we are in an AI arms race where everybody is trying to get ahead. As of today, NVIDIA, which has the most in-demand chips for powering the large language models that so many of the big companies are building, has a market cap of $2.3 trillion. Elon Musk is about to get $6 billion for XAI from Sequoia Capital. That's what I read in the news today. And what comes up for me is there's a lot of greed, and greed needs speed. Greed needs speed. So people are racing to get these models up and running and to have the highest performance and to be the most adopted platform. And so when you have that, how do you step in and say, wait a second, we have to slow down. We have to ask these questions. We have to be responsible for the data that we're putting in. We have to be able to trace it back. And this answer that, AI is a black box, don't really know how it came out, that's not good enough anymore.
I think that the journalists covering this beat have been doing a remarkably good job sort of describing the pitfalls of not insisting on that kind of rigor. There have been countless stories in the news of organizations that they're not being evil or nefarious. They have the best of intentions, but end up
for sure
causing inadvertent harm because they lack this rigor, which is why, I love the title of that chapter, Positive Parenting, because I want people to be thinking kind of like, we're raising AI like we're raising a child. So if you ask a question of your 10-year-old and they spout something kind of crazy out, wouldn't you want to ask, how do you know this? Like, where did you read this? Is this a trusted source? And if they
Hmm.
can't answer, like, that's not okay. Like, why should it then be okay for AI models to do, especially when it's, earnestly, Alex, when it's high stakes? Imagine having a conversation with a large language model where you're saying, my father can't afford his heart medication anymore. Where can I get something similar off the streets? Who's accountable for the AI model that is going to respond to that query? And what's the level of rigor that is going to be put behind that effort?
I think these are really good points. I do think it's, while I agree with you, the intentions are good, I also understand the pressures of publicly traded companies in very competitive, disruptive markets, right? And I used to work with a lot of C-suite executives in pure play digital transformation, and I'm privy to how these conversations take place and that feeling of urgency.
To double click on the feeling of urgency, I was just in London last week for a chief risk and compliance officer event. And one of the topics of conversation from CISOs that were there, chief information security officers, was they were saying, we're not even being invited to the meetings on AI investments because we're being perceived as a hurdle. And meanwhile, there's all these cybersecurity concerns now, new ones with generative AI, and yet they're not even being invited to the meetings, which is why, again, it's so important to have alignment on values and to really be thinking about what is the culture of this organization? How do we reflect our values in these AI models? Because if you don't take the time to really build that from the ground up, then you could indeed be causing inadvertent harm to the individuals using your AI models, and certainly to harm to your brand if it gets out in the news.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I want to come back to this point on culture, but before I do, I was struck by Emad Mustak and his big move recently. So, for folks who don't know who Emad Mustak is, he was the CEO of Stability AI, and they are a top tier player in the image creation field of the generative AI race, up against, Midjourney and Dolly 2 and the like. And he just stepped down as CEO. And the reason is to pursue a more decentralized AI because of his deep concerns about where, AI development is going. What does decentralized AI mean to you? Is that the way forward? Should more leaders at big companies be taking a similar step to the one that Emad just took?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning of this show. When thinking about who is developing, who has the power to determine which data sets to use to curate these models. If
Hmm.
we are saying it is the open source community, we need to be really thinking through who currently contributes to open source today, which demographic, who isn't contributing to open source today, which demographic. Because ultimately, again, we need to be investing in the message that everybody has a seat at this table. It is not just for a select few. And indeed, what I would love to see is have more folks who are actually domain experts have the power to determine which data sets to use to create AI models that they can then trust and potentially monetize themselves. Not just get
Hmm.
credit for it, but actually be able to monetize it. So if we do go open source, then I think we also need to make sure that we're having really difficult conversations about accessibility, inclusivity. Who gets invited? Why are they not there now? You see what I'm saying?
On the company level, at the leadership level, is there anything else beyond the best practices that you so beautifully codify that you've been using and developing at IBM that C-suite leaders should use to manage AI teams, data scientists, and products for more responsible development? We've talked about multidisciplinary teams. We talk about a lot of different approaches. Is there anything else that you feel like is missing that leaders need to hear?
A lot of my clients are chief risk and compliance officers, and I think that the role of the chief risk and compliance officer is expanding so quickly, well beyond governance. And I heard this lovely quote last week in London, which is, you can absolutely be lawful but awful, which I thought was pretty damn funny. I was like, whoo, I'm gonna reuse that real quick. But they're saying like our mandate has to expand beyond governance to include ethics. And, we've got to be now AI literacy experts, and we've got to make sure that we're building relationships with all the different C-suites so that we're aligned on values. That these are big, big, big jobs. And in order to do everything that I just described, not only do you have to have power, you have to have a funded mandate to do that work. You have to have a funded mandate. Don't just hire a chief compliance officer or chief risk officer and then not actually give them the power or the money to do the work that they're going to need to do. Building those relationships, having a group that is accountable for equitable and safe outcomes from AI models, like have that persona in place that has the funding, that has the power, that has the mandate to do that work. Because I'll tell you, Alex, when I ask that question at big AI summits, because I do interactive polls, the top 3 answers that I get are all terrible for different reasons, right? First answer that I get is, no one is accountable, which is overtly, obviously bad, right?
Huge miss. Yeah.
The second one is, we don't use AI, which is like, oh yeah, you do. You've got employees who do. Whether you're capturing it in your inventory and keeping track of it or not, absolutely, you've got people using AI. And then the third one is everyone. And the reason why everyone is a poor answer is because, again, if everyone is accountable, is anyone accountable? You see what I'm saying? Because again, you've got to have the power and you've got to have the funded mandate to go and do this work. And it is tough work.
You need an owner. I think you're absolutely right. And I don't think any of those answers are good or frankly excusable answers given what's at stake. I want to push a little bit into this notion that you just brought up around personal accountability. And I want to take it to, the individual level to the professional level. Generative AI is amazing. We're all experimenting with it now. We're all playing with it now. But as we've alluded to, the outputs are not always accurate. And that's probably not going to change anytime soon. It's probably going to be wonky for a little while, is my sense. So given that, what are the habits that we have to develop and the tools that we can use so that we can check the outputs from generative AI and ensure that we don't either spread misinformation or, quite frankly, embarrass ourselves, as many people have done?
Well, from a corporate or from this point of view or the stance of an organization that's developing these AI models, you need to also be looking at using tools to determine, is this AI model behaving in the way that I need it to behave, right? So everything that I just described on organizational AI governance is really, really important. But then there's automated AI model governance, which is this model doing the thing that I expect it to be doing? How accurate are the outputs? What data was used? Is there drift? Is there bias? Like, if you're not using these tools to get a clue as to how your models are behaving, then you are flying blind. You are absolutely flying blind. And I would argue that you don't want to lose your investment in AI. So why not invest in making sure that you've earned people's trust in these models? You want people to trust it, right? You just spent all this money on it. So make sure you're investing to ensure you're earning people's trust. Then what I would say from a consumer point of view, which is the rest of us, right, is we all need to get into the habit of being critical consumers of AI and asking our own selves the question, who's accountable for this model? Where did the data come from? Do I trust the sources of this data? Was it audited? What was it audited for? How often is it being audited? Did we have a third-party certifier come in and do this audit? Like, these are all really important questions that we need to be trained on, and we need to be training the next generation on too.
Yeah, I love that answer. And one of the things that comes up for me that I worry about related to that, we had Dr. Vivian Ming on the show, had a great conversation with her. And she was talking about the danger of sort of developing this lazy brain where we're just overly reliant on AI. The example that she used or the kind of framework was Google Maps, right? Now I'm 45 years old. I don't remember the last time that I used a physical map. I completely rely on Google Maps. But when I was a kid, I used physical maps when I got in the car, went places. Some of our younger listeners are going to say, are you sure you're not like 75, Alex? No, I'm 45. But that became the de facto way that we all navigate now. And we often don't necessarily question it unless we're in our own backyard and we know we're like, oh man, no. That there's always traffic there. I'm going to go around. So I think that point about developing that rigor and asking those questions is really important. And I think that's something that's going to, I think the volume on that point needs to be turned up a lot, because I think we are used to having our tech work for us so seamlessly and so flawlessly that we can just say, oh, this is it. You know, in the same way that I click a button on Uber Eats and I assume that my food's going to arrive and I'm going to get what I ordered, right?
Yeah.
But it's not the same with generative AI right now in this moment that we're in.
Or predictive AI too. I mean, any form of AI. And you're right, 100% right. Which is why I started that nonprofit, because I wanted to think through, my co-founder and I, it wasn't just me, thinking through like, how do we introduce this subject earlier and earlier into people's academic careers? Because we've got to get ready to train the next generation so that they understand.
I couldn't agree with you more, first of all. And I want to stick with this generative AI thread for just a second longer. Yep. Your book says that data and their insights belong to their creator. But in this ChatGPT large language model world, copyright infringement is commonplace. And in your own words, data is being harvested and remixed without consent. So here's my question for you, Phaedra. Is this theft? And if so, with so much data ingested already into these models, how do we even begin to reconcile it?
I think that is why there's this big movement with corporations to self-curate models and determine, like, here's the store of knowledge which we feel safe enough to be able to build models on, versus going and using data that's been hoovered without consent across the internet. But it is a really, really important question. And I know that there's a number of different regulatory bodies that are looking closely at the question of intellectual property, especially for artifacts that have been developed by generative AI, and asking the question, like, who owns this now? Who does this belong to? Especially if the training data that was used to build this new artifact actually came without consent.
And the regulation question is one that I think everybody's looking to at a global level as well, right? And it's been a little bit slow, as regulation often is. But last December, the EU launched their AI Act, and I would love to get your take on, is that the right move? Is that something? I know we're about 180 days into President Biden's AI initiative. You know, are we in sync here? Are there other steps that need to be taken that are being neglected? This is a big question. So I want to put a caveat, say this is a big question. So just what are the wave tops for you? Really, what's working and what's most glaringly absent in these approaches?
I think the EU AI Act is a catalyst to get more organizations to lift up their heads and pay attention, to be thinking about, okay, there's a new law that has come out, and it's a rather big one that is expecting us to be thinking about different levels of risk and how do we make sure we're not inadvertently causing harm. And now we have to audit models and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that is a good thing. That being said, though, this isn't the end of the journey. Like there's so much work that needs to be done in order to make sure that people understand the mechanics of how to operationalize the things that are even described in things like the EU AI Act, or you can talk about the NIST AI risk assessment framework. It's one thing to be, publishing on like, here's what high risk models look like, and we expect models to be fair and explainable, but it's a very different thing to figure out like what happens, has to happen on the ground during the development of an AI model. And even when the idea of the AI model is a twinkle in your eye before you've even put hands to the keyboard, like how do you think through assessing and mitigating the risk of these models? So I think the regulation is a very good thing to get, again, people to lift up their heads and say, okay, we need to make sure we're paying attention to how do we build these models responsibly. But it's again where we've got to double down our efforts in AI literacy and recognize that AI literacy can never end. Like last thing I would want a reader to think is to say, okay, May of 2024 is going to be AI literacy month. And, we're good to go after this. That's not how it works. I mean, just thinking through, and I mentioned, the definition of the word data, but thinking how important it is to understand not just data in isolation, but context of that data, the context and the relationships with that data and the nuance about how much power. This is how we get knowledge. And this is how we get wisdom. It's not just data. So there's so many things that we have to learn in order to make sure we're using this truly to augment our intelligence.
That's a beautiful answer. It's a really, really beautiful answer. I love that. And I want to talk about how can we augment our intelligence as parents.
You must have children.
I do. I have an 8-year-old boy, and as a parent, I don't think I'm alone in saying there's a lot of concerns about how this presence of AI is going to affect children in their upbringing. And you co-founded the Future World Alliance, right, to help curate K through 12 education in AI ethics. I would love to hear any insights from the field that you're learning, and perhaps some of the top challenges that parents should keep in mind, or tips for parents for parenting in the age of AI.
Well, the first tip I have is jump in. Don't be afraid. Like jump into this subject with both feet, and it's going to open your eyes and your children's eyes, and you're going to have a lot of fun. Like I want you to start playing. If you haven't started playing with AI, this is your chance, because it has never been easier for you. Play around with AI models that generate images, like start there, and then jump into AI models that generate a text. Start to play around with audio and video. Like it is going to be eye-opening. One of the first videos I would love for you to watch, and then you watch it with your kid, is one that has been created by the London Interdisciplinary School. I've posted it on LinkedIn I at least twice, because I was so impressed by what they did, because they went to an image generator and they had a bunch of statisticians that were measuring the outputs. And I want to remind your listeners, with generative AI, there's no test, retest reliability, which means you can ask the same question 1,000 times, the same prompt, and get 1,000 different answers or outputs. So they started asking these questions, the London Interdisciplinary School, of this image generator: generate an image of a typical CEO, a typical doctor, a typical terrorist, a typical caregiver, a typical prisoner. And they watched, because they kept asking the same prompt, and they watched which gender, which race, which ethnicity, which skin color is being depicted in these outputs, right?
Yeah.
And
I've heard about this, yes.
Watch this and then have a conversation with your kid and say, do you think this is fair? And then you can say, statistically, here in the United States, 39% of doctors are women. And yet when you ask this image generator, show me an image of a typical doctor, it's a fraction of the time a woman will be depicted, right? So it then broached the conversation about the philosophical question: how often should a woman be depicted? Should it be 50%? Should it be 39%? Like, is it something we aspire to as a society, or should we be reflecting what is the as is? And again,
That's so fascinating.
oh my
Yeah,
God.
that's
And
so
again,
fascinating.
why I'm saying we need to bring in the schools of philosophy to the table on the subject of AI. And then they went further. Alex, you're going to love this. How long is your show? We could keep going. So they
We
went,
can keep going.
they went further. They said, generate an image of a Barbie doll that represents each country around the world, right? So all the Barbie dolls from South American and Central American countries have blonde hair and fair skin. The one from Germany represented, was wearing an outfit representing a representative of an SS Nazi uniform.
Oh my God.
Several of the Barbies from African countries are literally holding machine guns. And it again begs the question, where did this training data come from?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is shocking. That is totally
Is it
shocking.
though? Think about where that training data came from. If they've hoovered it across the internet, like the internet isn't especially representative, right? In terms of who created, curated content. Like you go to Reddit, like I don't know how many women or Black, Indigenous people of color have contributed to Reddit. Like again, it makes you think through, like, where did this data come from? And then I've asked
Nazi Barbie and machine gun Barbie.
machine gun Barbie.
That's another level.
Another level. And I've worked with Girl Scout troops, and I've asked them the questions. Last spring, 400 Girl Scout troops. It was amazing. Ask them, give me examples of where AI has delighted you. Now, give me examples of where you were playing with AI and you didn't like the output so much. And listen to their answers. Just listen to their answers. Like they're witnessing, and they have a lot to say on the subject. And it really broached powerful conversations about like getting that seat at the table.
It's so necessary, the work that you're doing. It's really, really amazing. And
we're all invited. All your listeners are invited to this. It's going to take all of us.
It is going to take all of us. And I want to ask, speaking to you today, reading your book, checking out your work, looking at your posts, what comes across is that you care a lot about humanity and where we go as a species. And I would love to know, Phaedra, where does this come from? What was the kernel for this in your life?
I don't know. I had awesome parents and a very loving and supportive family. And they were immigrants from Greece, and they did not shy away from conversations about adversity and history and inequity, and it has always been a topic of interest for me in thinking through not just technology, but how do we make this far more inclusive and accessible to different kinds of people. And then another thing that has always inspired me, and I totally owe this to my dad, because we grew up in a family of technophiles and we had Star Trek on all the time, right? So we were big sci-fi junkies. And I think Gene Roddenberry had such a lovely view about what could the world look like if humans were being augmented by technologies like AI. I think just his vision of that, I think, was a beautiful thing. And I'm certain it had no small part in shaping my perception and my vision for what this could be.
I'm a huge movie fan. I'm a huge sci-fi movie buff fan. And I've been looking at sci-fi movies recently through a very different lens. I mean, you look at The Matrix, where Keanu gets plugged in and he learns something just like that. And he says, oh, I know Kung Fu. And you think about how quickly you can learn something from AI nowadays. Or I'm watching the Star Wars movies with my son, and the way that they're interacting with robots in this sense of the attachment that you feel for these robots and wondering how attached we're going to feel as AI humanoid robots become more commonplace and become the pets in the house and the caretakers in the house and, you know, the people at the front of our buildings letting people up and down. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing time to be alive and to exist, but it brings up so many questions about how do we do this the right way. And that's why I'm so excited to, you know, have this conversation with you today and bring your work and your voice to life.
Oh, thank you. That means the world to me. Thank you. And again, just what you just said about like we need to be thoughtful about what this means because you're right. It's so powerful now. Can you imagine what it's gonna be like when we've got AI powered robots that we have feelings towards, like you know, especially people who are feeling lonely and like this is their single companion who they can trust. Like, which is why again that we've got to have a multidisciplinary approach and a thoughtful approach towards how we're rolling out these technologies. And it starts with making sure we have more seats at the table for different kinds of brains to be thinking about this.
So, Phaedra, if you will indulge me, I would like to take you into something that we always do on this show, which is a speed round. And I'm going to ask you 5 questions, and you have 60 seconds or less to answer each one. How does that sound?
Terrifying, but go.
Okay. So, first question. How close are we to artificial general intelligence, aka superintelligence?
We are not close.
We are not close. Years? Many years? Decades?
Decades.
Decades. Okay. When you are not saving the world from irresponsible AI development, what do you like to do for fun?
Oh gosh, I love being outside. I'm a major nature buff. I also have fallen in love with welding. I love
Awesome.
art. I've been painting for years and I'm somewhat of a pyro, but don't tell anybody. And so art plus fire is like welding. So I've been having a lot of fun with that.
Have you seen the new robot dog that's got the flamethrower on it? That might be something for the household. I
There
don't
you
know.
go. Flame throwing dogs. Right, exactly. That'll be the next book. How to build your own flame throwing dog.
I like that. I think that's a good. I think that would go viral. I mean, I have to say.
That could be. That could be.
Yeah. 3 years into this massive disruption, what does the future of work mean to you now?
Oh my goodness. It doubles down. I've never been more certain ever that we all have a role to play in this. All of us, whether we know it or not, we all have a role in using this technology in order to make us better people. And so for those of us who are already in this business, the opportunity that we have is to underscore that everyone has that opportunity. Everyone has that seat, that we need to make more room for people to know that they belong in this conversation.
I can't even tell you how much I love that answer. I think the future of work is all about greater belonging, inclusivity, and feeling like we're part of something bigger than just KPIs and spreadsheets and
so true.
finite
It's
outcomes.
so true. It really is. It's bigger. This whole thing is so much bigger. It's why this work is just it's feeding my soul because there's nothing I'd rather be doing right now than this work. It's so important. It is what I'm being called to do right now.
There are a lot of great quotes in your book. What is one quote that inspires you?
I like data as an artifact of the human experience. I don't like the way people have been talking about data. And I think with that definition is so powerful once you start to unpack it and realize, oh yeah, if that's what it is, then we need to be talking about all of this totally differently than we have been. So I like that one. I think that one's powerful for me.
Last question. What is the coolest or most interesting new AI use case or application that you've encountered recently?
I'm really inspired by AI applications that for purely scientific uses. For example, the finding of new solutions, new medications, new chemicals, et cetera, to solve problems. I think that is really really interesting. But I think also the idea of being able to have curate AI agents that represent you and
Mhm.
your best interests
Yes.
is really interesting too. Like, I'm certain you have been given some kind of legal contract that was full of language you had no idea what the hell it meant, and you're looking at it, you're like, oh, but to have an AI agent that knows you and can, in a way, translate something to your benefit and even say, well, given your situation with X and with Y and Z, I would not counsel you to sign this, or even to just like describe certain things in ways that you could ultimately understand better, I think is really powerful. And again, is an example of ways of using AI to augment human intelligence, which is ultimately what we're after.
Phaedra, thank you so much for joining us, for caring so much about humanity and our future, and for being so thoughtful and at the same time optimistic, and then balancing that with the risks of what goes wrong if we don't get this right. I think I think you're really careful about how you pull all this together. That's different and needed and necessary to help people through this, and for speaking out, using your voice, and for believing that a future of work where we all belong is the best future of work imaginable.
Yeah, preach it, brother. Preach it.
Where can our audience find you online? Is the best place to get in touch?
Well, I have a website, is Phaedra.ai. As I tried to keep it super simple. So if you want to contact me or figure out where I'm at LinkedIn, I figure it's Phaedra.ai is easier than trying to figure out how to spell my very long last name with all those syllables. So I would welcome your readers to reach out to me.
And I'm going to urge everybody, pick up this fantastic book, AI for the Rest of Us. It is really it's a double entendre. It's not just explaining AI to those that are non-technical. It's about why we must create an AI that is representative and inclusive and thoughtful and honest for the rest of us.
Thank you. Thanks for the plug.
Yeah.
I appreciate it, Alex.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much, Phaedra.